As noble citizens, we must bypass a life of dormancy and vice to pursue the generative endeavor of a hard day's work. The benefits of these pursuits are not secured by chance or charity, but through the merit of your character and the firmness of your convictions. It is you who are planting the seeds of trees whose shade you know you shall never see.
We're in. What's up? Hello, welcome everybody. We're in the Broken Wind podcast. We just started up, and I wanted to ask my co-host here, my number one guy, the podcast producer with the most, Vane, about whether he does a lot of groaning when he sits up and down. Are you at that old man stage yet?
Yeah, I'm starting to groan a little bit and have like constant aches and pains. Like one worse me than the other.
Oh, when I'm sitting up. Oh my God, it's hilarious. I sound ridiculous. Sound like we're old men on this podcast. We're old men. So
old millennials.
Old geriatric millennials. So I actually, we wanted to just sort of catch up as pals at the top of this podcast because the listeners may know we haven't done one of these in a while. And my producer over here has been doing a great job of putting out what we got, but
putting out the archive.
Yep, we've been sort of absentee podcasting here a little bit. At least I have, certainly. I went out for.
Hey, when in Rome, right?
I went out for cigarettes as a podcast co-host, and I haven't been a very good. But you know what? This sorry to make you the mom in this metaphor, but I do feel like this podcast is our baby, and I'm very proud of what we're doing here. So thank you for listening if you are. And yes, my co-host is alluding to a bit of travel I may or may not have been doing recently, which was cool. I was actually in the Vatican area around the same time as the infamous Pope Leo is weak on crime tweet, which
Chicago Pope.
All time great. I'll tell you. From
not
my experience,
favorite Pope.
Not my favorite Pope. And then all these oh God. I mean, but the thing that I was thinking about that was making me laugh was how the Vatican City, enormously beautiful, peaceful place, and the biggest crime that's probably ongoing all the time that the Pope is weak on is gay sex, and that's only a crime in the Catholic sense. So it's really a pretty safe place. So I don't know. I didn't have the pleasure of being there for a long time. But how have you been, my friend? I know you've been gardening a bit.
Yeah, I've been living at home, editing old podcasts. So I hope you enjoyed that Kendrick Lamar and Drake beef. That was very timely.
Very timely. Well, I do think we talked to, I mean, the whole colonizer identity keeps coming up. So that was one of those things. That was one of the things I found most fascinating about that whole discussion, ultimately, is the way that Kendrick Lamar brought that term into the whole beef, which I think is kind of novel in hindsight. I don't know. But yeah, so I need to, check in on those boys sometime. But yeah, so we're
doing it.
Haven't been here lately. I know, right? We were here to catch up on the news, and it's so ever crazy, right? But it's at the same time too. I mean, I think it's funny to think about how little has actually even changed in the time since we last talked. Unfortunately,
we probably took the longest break we've taken since the start of the show, really.
Yeah,
and it's become sort of a monotonous drone now at this point of just the war machine going on.
Yeah, dude. I know. Well, yeah, we were talking about it before, when it all started, how depressing it was to see going, and I do note the distinct lack of bloodthirsty energy, but then at the same time, it's more about the dispassionate apathy that is ultimately what kills people. So. Yeah, I mean, that's the sad part is we are seeing the war machine grind on. We are seeing the war machine continue to commit untold atrocities to Iran, to Lebanon, by Israel in that case. But it's really just, I mean, the same old bullshit. The double blockade is hilarious. And you and I have been texting quite a bit about the
blockade.
absolute Yeah, the absolute, like...
I raise you one blockade.
Like a
gets us a
masterclass
negative blockade.
in how
Does
to
that
completely...
mean straight open?
Yeah, a masterclass in how to completely over your whole presidency. I mean, Kash Patel has been really, doing great too. So we have a lot to cover.
And he reportedly too, Trump reportedly said in private that he's worried now about his presidency turning into a Carter presidency, essentially.
Yeah, well, I guess that's how we wanted to sort of open the news part of the discussion of the show, because there's so many layers to it. But to take a broader scope, I would say MAGA is in decline. And I just think it's kind of hard for them to deny at this point. And what else is ascendant is I think, a sort of more nebulous and entertaining question, and we'll get to that. But the Trump movement has been fracturing since, the day one, really, of the first administration, but it's just had a lot more layers to crack apart than I think everyone, sort of expected, or at least the Democrats did, certainly. And you can really tell they're getting down to the bedrock, because all the sex freaks and drunks and real, like, the ones who have to truly be delusional to be diehard at this point are proving themselves to be as such. So it's cool.
And then, as they say, the rats are fleeing the sinking ship, and so you have
exactly
basically Tucker Carlson and Megyn Kelly, who we've talked about before, as going against the grain from the rest of the conservative movement at times, and you have really the whole manosphere podcasting space that went pretty hard for Trump, as well as virtually every demographic you can think of that went for Trump in this, that went towards Trump, whether it be women or married couples or minorities, immigrants. Every single one of those groups is just completely shattered that he had made gains with. And it seems like, as you said, MAGA and the Republican Party, by extension, is dying. And that was going to be the high watermark of your popularity amongst those demographics. You'll never attain that ever again, not under the umbrella of the Republican Party. And I don't know, maybe we're actually facing some type of moment, like a political realignment, maybe some kind of possibility.
I hope so.
There's a aperture or window that opens.
Some interesting things start.
Yeah.
Well, and what's I think a good succinct way to put it is that the MAGA movement is in decline, and the Republican Party has returned to being in decline from its brief salvaging by its
oppositional nature, essentially. And ultimately, like liberalism, the love for debate, that even though the New Deal Democratic Party really synthesized former debates that were taking place in the Gilded Age and the Progressive era, it's like we basically had a soft political revolution, very similar to what happened in Russia with the Soviets, but we didn't call it a new country or a full political revolution. We called it a political realignment. But in so many ways, it's very similar also what happened in that moment. And it was the creation of the modern state that these people have opposed. Like you have your Curtis Yarvins and people like that, and the Republican underbelly that has just opposed the idea of a state. But ultimately, I was saying that the Democratic Party really achieved a synthesis that made the Republican Party and former parties obsolete, and almost could have become a one-party government if it weren't for America's love for rational debate, the love for having an oppositional figure at all times, even though it's completely unnecessary. It's not necessary in any way to maintain
you make them work for it. You don't do the work for them. It's crazy.
You don't need the Milton Friedman and the contrarian economic worldview that is oppositional to the actually scientific emerging reality of Keynesian economics and other things.
In metaphorical terms, in politics, when you have the opportunity to decisively to remove your opposition party from politics for the rest of, the foreseeable future, do it.
Yeah.
Don't neglect to do it.
If we were to look at this as
you're fucking fetishizing debate and rationality, and like you said, having this oppositional figure. That's, I think, one lesson we should learn from the Chinese.
Yeah, if we look at the formation of the state as a science, like the concept of political science ought to do, it really would tell us that there should be some kind of scientific understanding of how revolution happens, and that some sort of objective realities take place, like drafting a new currency under a new state always happens, and you can actually just recognize that as a scientific reality that gets rejected constantly by these contrarian liberals at their heart, ultimately.
And we're foreshadowing how we want to end the episode, which is I want to let my pal here just absolutely go off, B-boy style, just really get in the cipher about economics and, what money. We want to really let him get in there and talk money, because we have a lot of thoughts on it and we talk about it all the time.
We talk money, we have none.
One thing I want to yes. One thing I want to mention as well about your comparison to the New Deal era and the Bolshevik Revolution. It's hilariously Red Scare era in its own way, but also there's some truth to it. And I think one of the fundamental differences is the decrepit nature of the Russian monarchical state in relation to what came afterwards. There was a lot more clearing of the house, clearing of the decks, and starting fresh than you've ever had in the United States.
Right.
And I feel that it's really starting to show is what's kind of where we are now.
Yeah, there's another theme we've constantly talked about throughout the show and in the Florida series. That is a little promo for that. But we've constantly talked about how America is really kind of afraid of its own shadow and afraid of the concept of a forming state, which we've gone back to the idea that a state...
We're the most dominant state on Earth, and
it becomes the most dominant state by embracing the liberal philosophy that says government is bad, and it's ultimately this self-conflicted belief of fully embracing the state while saying you're not at the same time. And completely recognizing the need for a state and for currency and the need to enforce the law and things like that, as long as it's in your own rational self-interest.
Rational economic self-interest, right. And it's working backwards from those premises, and that's how we got the modern state in so many ways.
And working backwards from that, working backwards from the idea that the government must be inherently bad and all governments are inherently bad. And so that there's something inherently American to that notion that's deep-rooted in the American psychology, that as we approach this concept of a new political realignment or a political evolution or even a revolution, we become afraid of that and we run from that. And we say that we didn't have a revolution under FDR, actually. It was just a New Deal. It was just a political realignment, but it was very close, actually, about as close as America had, other than the Civil War.
To really broaden the scope, too, it's I think oftentimes about the 30 Years' War, as I'm sure you do, at times too, my friend, especially being in, the heartland of Catholicism. As one thing I was sad I wasn't able to do was go into the Vatican and see some of the places that they scratched Martin Luther's name into the wall of the Vatican. But you really do.
I think that would have been in Germany, actually, right? Martin Luther?
No, it is in Rome. And the reality is that the spectacle of religion that Catholicism had to do to maintain its superstructural power is quite a sight to behold. And there is all of this thinking about just this flood of Germans out of Europe into America, and the kind of thing they were fleeing, or half, it was 50% of Germany after the 30 Years' War. And I don't know why, but it's I always think about this in relation to the sort of constant bifurcated internal stress of the American political mind palace of building the most powerful state on earth while also believing that you can have this yeoman fantasy that's very Jeffersonian too, something we talk about a lot. But I mean, the MAGA movement feels like a very powerful, the guttural last grasp of such a movement, and it's very fitting that I was thinking about do you think that the comparison of the Trump family to the Habsburgs has become fair?
I think it will be. I certainly think it will become fair in the grand scheme, and I do often have those thoughts of the grand scheme in the long term.
Time is a flat circle, right?
Yeah, time is just a flat circle, and our measly, tiny little life experience is just a small part of such a large story that's playing out. And thankfully, we have sort of things like the internet today, which has been really great, that for people who want to, they can take it upon themselves to actually learn more about history than possibly at any point in human history. Not to say that even close to everybody does that.
You know what the funny part of that metaphor is, too, the more I think about it, is if the Trumps are the Habsburgs, that means the Republican Party is the Holy Roman Empire.
Yeah.
Right? But it's I don't know. I mean, it's who knows what the future holds. The reason I was talking about that, though, too, is that there's this intangible sort of out of the nature of willpower, and the nature of is the will even a real thing, and the epigenetic memory of all of these highly traumatized Germans fleeing from these religious conflicts, and yet finding them still knocking on their doors and being neurotically obsessed with avoiding them, while at the same time just sort of stumbling into them all the time. And there's that stumbling in. It's we did being regrettably forced to do the thing you wanted to do the whole time. It's that America mastered that art in the 18th century.
We could easily do a whole episode talking about the German psyche and how that leads to it's incredibly interesting to think about the world through the lens of German history. I've talked about trying to do a series focused on Russia or Italy for telling the history of the world, but equally just as fascinating would be the Germans, because they have the rational tradition as embodied by Kant and Hegel and even I would say Descartes.
As annoying as those,
the notion of pure rationalism, that nothing exists unless it can be proven in the rational domain. And that even leads to, I shared a story or a chapter from the book by Dennis Rushkoff, I think. It's called Survival of the Richest. And this chapter talked about this philosophy that's embodied by a lot of the modern new atheist crowd, like Richard Dawkins. And it's been around forever, this pure denial of anything that could possibly be construed as outside of material philosophy. And I think we actually reject that on this show. Even though we embrace materialist dialectics, it's important that when you embrace that, you recognize you don't have a dogmatically materialistic worldview.
Yeah, there's an unknowable nature to reality that I think is always important to acknowledge, and it's part of what I think one of the fundamental shortcomings of AI is, that will never fully be quantified.
Yeah.
And you can call that cope all you fucking want, but still takes a lot less water and fucking food to make a human being who's incredibly capable as compared to these dumb fucking chatbots that everyone wants you to be impressed with.
And we've talked about the kind of differences between Eastern and Western philosophy, not to get in a big tangent about that, but the Eastern philosophy,
I'll steer you back.
We've both found the usefulness of Eastern philosophy, like Taoism, in recognizing the nature of doubt and the nature of things we can't prove at the time, and perhaps our own sort of spirituality, or at least my own sense of spirituality, partially comes from contemplating on those sorts of things.
Well, I wanted to say something. Too, which is that, like, I am in a existence where I deal with a lot of people from different backgrounds and speak different languages, and I have learned a lot about trying to communicate with people. It's something I believe in very deeply, in like a spiritual way. But I've also learned too that it's an interesting sort of thing where it's like, in English, the word trying has almost this taboo, especially in a professional context, because everyone's so afraid of trying, and they just want to always be doing.
They're saying, so, there is no try, only do.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But when you're talking about the other language, it's like, you got to try.
They don't have the same
to get there.
Yeah, and they're not going to have the same. Perhaps they won't have the same negative connotations around their word "trying" as you do.
We've really spiraled out here too, but we're just sort of catching up as pals. And again, like, it's just happening in circles the way we predict. Like, we were literally laughing about how we had joked about on our last Conservative Wind episode that the conservatives were going to be using AI to show them the reality that they wanted to exist. And then, lo and behold, the Israelis are doing exactly that.
Of course, but it was predictable. It's like, if you get like, that grand scheme of history that we were talking about, you start to be able to make these predictions, and you don't always want them to be coming true, actually.
No, most of the time you don't, honestly.
Yeah, I'd rather not be right, but really I keep ending up being right, and that's really annoying.
They call it Cassandra syndrome. Yeah.
Rather than these charlatans like the Tucker Carlsons or whoever else are just tossing constant Hail Marys.
I know, and then also still astute enough to recognize that Americans are done with this Israel bullshit because they were done paying with war in the early 2000s because their lives suck. And I mean, I heard this, I was saying this to our co-host Crocus, who will be returning soon, that I listened to, we're going to talk about the Hassan discourse in a second here after we sort of check in on the war, but I heard some pundit the other day talking about how, like, oh, well, we talked about Joe Rogan of the left, and then this guy, came around, and then there's all these influential, these young men who the Democrats want to get back, and they get their politics from listening to this guy, and it was like, listening to that and being like, you motherfuckers are still so goddamn out of touch that you don't understand. It's the complete opposite process. It's people recognizing the stuff that already exists in their reality and then hearing this one person out there who has who's finally
willing to say it.
This is actually what the average American is dealing with. They would like to have health care and free education.
And you finally have a guy saying that, and they say, no, really that's controversial. Simple. So it does become very simple to see.
Interesting way. I think Hassan never says it because he's very astute, but I've been thinking about this a lot too, being in Europe, that, like, I do fundamentally really believe that there is a need to redefine American nationalism as an idea, because I actually don't think a state can exist in any sense without a sort of, like, idea of a national project and, like, a belief from people
I agree.
That they want their, like, community and the place they live and the people who live in it.
You can't have a neutral state. I totally agree. And yet that seems to be the news and that reality of quote unquote objectivity, what they're trying to establish as a baseline, which is obvious why. Their incentive structure must be, if it's only owned by the owners of the means of production, if they're only private owners of capital get to own the media, then they are going to have an incentive in making the media say everything is okay all the time. And never questioning the status quo. And so to just have someone questioning the status quo becomes a breath of fresh air to people. And also it no longer really takes, like in the past where it used to require someone like, you only had basically academics like Noam Chomsky digging through newspaper articles in the Sunday Times and figuring out the falsehoods with the narratives that the state was giving us. And it took a dedicated few people to really recognize what is now completely obvious, the naked, grotesque imperialism, that it doesn't really take long to explain to people now why all the media sounds exactly the same, whether it's the CNN or Fox News. They sound exactly the same about Hassan, even though they're theoretically supposed to be on opposite sides. And so it no longer takes, again, like a degree in political science or something in order to figure out, oh, this is kayfabe, basically, that both sides are actually working together. I've seen the Harlem Globetrotters before. I know what that act looks like. And these theories like the rotating villain start to become just obvious realities that are clearly happening, that anybody can see and are undeniable in many ways. Or the grotesque corruption, saying that this administration is cartoonishly corrupt.
The gambling on the Iran war, the pretending that the Strait is open to juice the market.
Yeah, the level of gambling being thrown in your face. The average person knows something is actually wrong.
Is a gambling ad now. Everything is a fucking gambling ad. That's part of the reason I wanted to talk about the mafia. Is it's like, God, it's like there was a time when people had some fucking decency to pretend like this shit wasn't the
had to be underground.
Like, the entire undergirding of everything in the economy. But guess what? We stripped it down to the copper wires, so there's nothing fucking left. It's unreal.
Yeah, it's like in the movie The Godfather, Vito Corleone talks about getting into an industry that's clean so that he can become a senator. And isn't that the American dream? Like the idea of this corrupt, crooked family getting their family member centered, becoming a senator or becoming the president. Like you've got the Kennedy families or even the Trump family now, as we've talked about them being the new modern dynasty. And then you have other people.
If we tug on that metaphor too much, it might fall apart. We got to be careful with that one. But hey, why don't we pivot?
Yeah, let's pivot. Let's go.
I was gonna say, so like the Iran, like I said, I've been traveling. I haven't been keeping up. We're both a couple of working stiffs, so we're always really busy. Not always doom scrolling, thankfully. But we, get that in. I mean, but overall, not keeping up on the Iran war. How's it going? It seems like, it must be going well. It's certainly costing a great deal. So it's,
Oh, yeah.
I'm sure it's going well, right?
The thing that has the most influence on the market definitely seems to be whatever Donald Trump happens to be tweeting.
Yeah.
If he tweets something, the market is going to be affected by that. And so like you might have your own feeling about how the economy is doing or how your personal wallet is feeling or things like that. And you might wake up feeling like I sometimes do. I wonder, is today an up day or a down day on the market? Because that kind of allows you to engage with the outside world and to recognize there's some sort of objectivity supposedly out there, that everybody can agree on one set price for everything, right? That's the market.
It seems everyone has agreed that gas is $4 a fucking gallon now, so that's pretty cool. Loving that. It's going awesome.
Yeah, so we've all agreed that since the beginning of the year, gas is 50% more expensive, and it's here to stay. But Donald Trump says that the prices are going to come down, and that has created a spread between the futures market, the paper market, as it's sometimes called, and then the spot price, which most people look at the Brent oil price for that one, which is what oil is trading at currently. And so the futures market, strangely, has the price of a barrel of oil much lower than right now. So it keeps assuming, based on, I wonder why, because maybe, as I said, the market seems to listen to one guy really an incredibly high amount more than any other information. So you might have heard some sort of news, but it doesn't really matter, because whatever Donald Trump tweets, if he signals that the market's going up, it's going to go up. And even though in the last episode we talked about how we'd been in essentially a 6-month-long recession that was underreported.
Oh, God,
Don't worry, because all of that was recovered in less than 7 days in one of the most unprecedented moves in the market in history. And that's all completely normal and definitely rational. based
good,
on good,
valid,
rational. People understand why.
Sense.
Yeah, people understand why the stock market is trading higher than when the Iran war started, even though the strait seems to be closed. But the big man keeps announcing that ships are getting through, and then they get blown up.
What we're learning is that essentially we need to get kids addicted to gambling as early as possible. And that the reason is because people who trade stocks are the most smart and productive people on earth. And
Obviously.
You can't really get into that unless you're addicted to gambling already. So it's all like a synergistic thing where it's like the stock market has gotten crazier than ever, but don't worry, they're going to pay for everyone's 401k.
Right. And technically,
it's all going to be good.
Yeah.
It's all gravy, and we're going to make all the babies into gamblers.
Yeah. And technically, since the biggest mover of the market is the guy who makes the announcements.
Baby gambler on earth, the legend. The ledge himself.
So if you happen to know what he's going to do, even when he's announcing something else, that's actually going to pay out for you as it has for multiple insiders on multiple occasions at this point. Trading on insider information.
It's such old hat. It's such old hat. It's been said to death. It's been not even it didn't even start during the Trump administration, really. It's hard to even pin down. I mean, we would argue probably even as far back as Florida that this fucking Constitution shit, this American democracy shit, I'm sorry, but this shit is a sham. This shit, the rules don't make sense. It's all opportunistic, basically fucking landlord against landlord violence. Always has been, always will be.
Just a patchwork of 50 separate states piecing together the bare minimum amount of
a union.
Bare minimum legal agreement that's possible.
Extinguish the embarrassment of chattel slavery while still continuing really their violent conquest of the indigenous peoples and, getting all of the land. It's wild, dude. One of my favorite, this will come up in the Florida series eventually anyway, but after the Civil War, Florida had slavery for I think 3 to 5 more years before, because again, I don't know if it was technically, what year is the Civil War? No, it was part of America by that time. It just took a while. I don't know if it was after Texas, though. I think it might have been. I have to look it up, but I think Texas might have been last.
Yeah, and there was the quiet agreement, basically, to allow the Electoral College to still favor the South so that they would join in the Union, and that being one of the major agreements, and the other one being paying those southern men basically their bonds back in gold, essentially, and choking the U.S. economy for the next decade or two.
I think we can actually probably pivot here to Vane's economic corner here soon too, and we can just talk money for the rest of the show because. What else was born during the run-up to the Civil War era? One of our favorite monetary inventions in economics, fiat currency.
The old greenback.
The old motherfucking greenback. Just printing money and saying, look, this is the American dollar, and it's backed by the full faith and confidence of the U.S. government and its court system and its prisons.
Yeah. And as we were saying...
That works, and it's people who work.
Yeah, there's a liberal aversion to the concept of the state coming into being, to the recognition that the simple reality is that the purpose of a state is to direct resources wherever influence concentrates.
Right.
And so with that denial, we are constantly imagining that a state could possibly operate in any other way besides as a spoils system. And so America is constantly surprised to find that it works by nepotism and that it keeps recreating the original conditions of feudalism over and over again by making a system of property or inheritance by dynastic rule, essentially.
Right.
And over and over, we find that we name entire states after people like Washington. And isn't that very much like what a kingdom does, is to name its entire places and all of its things and all of its concepts after its so-called forefathers. So what we've been doing, as we constantly always unpack this in the grand scheme, is that we're building an empire here. We're trying to recreate the Roman Empire, but we don't want to explicitly say so. We don't want to say that the point is to conquer the world, even though it is. And so we created a self-conflicted philosophy that is at the same time claims to have an aversion to seizing power and developing the state, but at the same time just does that constantly builds a larger and larger state, ultimately because it's necessary is kind of the argument that I'm getting at.
But the thing I was going to say, too, is, like, I think one of the most interesting parts of getting out of the Anglosphere a little bit, and I think one of the reasons it's so important for people to do, is because this little French guy, Napoleon, is just, like, completely absent from all of, not completely, but, like, by and large absent in any certain, like, antagonistic sense from history in the United States. And obviously there's, like, geographical reasons for that, but it has this way of sort of leaving liberalism as this, like, relatively untainted and like Simon Pure ideology that never clearly turned in on itself and completely, which obviously is like what happened with fascism too, and like communism's failures. Like I think a certain Chinese communist would argue that many of communism's failures are a result of like holdovers from liberalism. And to be clear too, like liberalism, one of its core reasons it has conflict with the state at like a foundational ideological level is like one of the core parts of liberalism that the French very much embraced and is part of what was so successful about the post-revolutionary French state was this belief in the true supremacy of like individualism and the difference between, you know, so like how some individuals, regardless of their birth, the station of their birth, are just more exceptional than others. And it's advantageous to sort for that.
And wouldn't they already have property?
Right.
Yeah, that's why we implicitly said we're going to, the founders of this country implicitly created a system where only property holders have power because they had a essentially Protestant worldview behind them that only the productive people would have, or Catholic. It's kind of mixed up in this. It's conflated, I think. Yeah, that's part of the interesting
now we're in this,
conflict.
Like, weird inverted world too, where like you see all this noise Spain is making too.
But it's this assumption that those who hold property must have earned it inherently.
Right.
And that goes way back to the rules that set feudalism up of primitive accumulation and assuming the person that got to accumulate the most shit obviously deserves it inherently. That was the natural way. So that's the free market. They naturally got there.
And to tie up my point about Napoleon there too, the reason I think all that's so important is that like I said, in America, liberalism has this like Simon Pure legacy of being a part of the ideology. Like I'm a Yankee Doodle Dandy. The Yankees were like libs. They were like British libs essentially. And the reality is for many parts of Europe, for Spain certainly, and many other parts of Latin, it's like colonial world certainly, liberalism was an invading scourge, and it's not because it was necessarily wrong. And many of the people who interacted with those liberals actually admired them over the system that they lived within. So that history always has that sort of like churn and give and take from people who admire things about the people who come into their lands to do ostensible harm and take what they want from them. But then there's like an inverted process too. That is why like the whole world is such an interesting tapestry and continuum of people, and it's like one of those things
it's
that
all
like
a continuum.
Gives me hope. Yeah, like it's something that, like especially like being out in the world these days.
And there was at some point the story of the emergence of capitalism out of the conditions of feudalism, really the role of the ruling elite embracing the values of liberalism slowly is part of that story. Because at first they rejected it. At first they rejected the notion of science and Enlightenment values. And then eventually they recognized,
the Catholics did come around a little bit. Yeah.
If this system says that the people who already have all the money are inherently good, then all I have to do is play along with the rules of this system. Why would I not do that?
Right. Well, to tie off my point about Spain too, it's like you now get these like historical like ebbs and flows where it's like because of the wake of the explosive energy that liberalism like broke through the feudal era, and then so many things proceeded afterwards. You get these moments where it's like Spain obviously like was the place where many anarchists still have a chip on their shoulder about the tankies, and yet now Spain is in some senses like leading the charge in the social democratic world about
isn't that funny how that
not being a part of the Anglosphere anymore.
Yeah, and Spain was on the Italian fascist side,
right? But
they were on the Axis, more on the Axis side, not 100% formally, is my understanding.
Right.
Certainly, Portugal was not formally, even though they were very fascist aligned during that time. And then I believe Spain under Franco was just a little bit closer than Salazar's Portugal to the fascist world, while still not being fully allied with them. I don't believe they were pulled into the war with them.
One of these rumors I heard a while ago too about like the Spanish during this period was that during these most recent periods of like economic upheaval and obviously the Ukraine war causing a lot of turmoil for European economies and trade flows, but embargoes are just the state of reality now too, is the point I'm getting at here, that like the Russians have been under embargo, and yet the Spanish, I believe, have been doing business with them with natural gas and doing, going gangbusters for that reason. And that is a national collaboration that goes back to the Napoleonic era and the wars against Napoleon. That is during one of the, I can't remember what they were called, but there were so many of the like wars of alliances, and there were a bunch of different alliances in Europe, and Spain and Russia were at one point aligned against Napoleon. So we've now got all these like weird dynamics bubbling back up, and all of these like
similar to the 30 Years' War.
Yeah, but colonialism is now front and center in all of this too. And I think in the non-Anglo sphere, with all of the problems that are inherent to it, there is, I think, a more self-conscious acceptance of the wake and violence of colonialism and a desire to sort of like live more in a more egalitarian way with the people who live in the same country as you. And like I said, there's obviously huge problems in places like Spain and Portugal and Brazil. It's like majorly around racism and ethnic, cultural, economic divisions. But I mean, there is at least like in the Anglosphere in America, it's like these things we don't talk about them because we were a colony and we had a revolution to break free from our masters, even though the true story is a lot more complicated than that. And that gives us this blind spot that is so frustrating, especially with it's why Israel is this perfect partner. It's why Israel will never it's why the discussion of like who's in charge is stupid. It's like they are in so many senses the same kind of country, in that they're like this post-colonial country that was able to command their own sort of nationalist European Reich to build their own state. And I think that's, sort of a very roundabout point, but I don't know.
We had talked too about the German history.
We're just having fun here, guys.
Yeah, we are. We're just going around in circles, but that's kind of the point on this one.
That's what we do. That's always. That's why we've been.
This one's a free-flowing discussion
for a long time.
But yeah, we were talking about Germans too, and I think it can tie into the history of Germany, where they really, in some ways, invented the rational world around them. Like it or not, they created, say, the concept of psychology, and they would credit themselves as being the first to discover that.
Right.
They credit themselves with being the first really to discover music and the musical tradition, the Western musical tradition. They would argue owes a great deal to the three great composers of the Western classical tradition, which are obviously Bach, Mozart, and Beethoven. And this is, I'm having a little fun here, but it's these are the sorts of things that set up many of these expectations that we still have to this day, that what are higher forms of music than other, and they are the ones that have the most appeal to a rational scientific approach. And in so many ways, the Germans can be credited as being the fathers of modern engineering in so many different industries. Audio engineering is one of them.
Europe.
Yeah, synthesis, creating the first organs. And
we're a couple of music lovers here.
In many ways, they created I wouldn't say entirely, but during a period of like a great Enlightenment period, you start to write down history, as the ancient Greeks did with Herodotus too, and they arguably had the first Western historian and created the concept even of Western history that still runs through to this day.
Well, it's all just storytelling.
That happened in Germany too. This self-conceptualizing itself. That is very much like the tradition of Descartes and that pure rationality that I was talking about too, with the new science crowd saying nothing exists outside the provable empirical reality. It's not possible that anything exists outside the scientific realm. And to the German imagination, it's not possible that there was any history before Germany. It's not possible that there was science or music before Germany. And in many ways, these concepts led to nationalism and led to the militarism of World War I and World War II. And yet we still have societies, we would argue, like Israel and the United States, that are constantly reinventing these sorts of self-conceptions and these grand historical narratives that don't actually make sense in reality. But in a way, you're able to construct the whole world around yourself and to say, we are the only people who exist, who have ever existed here. Don't bother asking about the people who lived here before, because we were the ones who mattered.
Yeah, and it's so interesting how around that same period of time, you have all these like literal individual figures who are created as these Uncle Sam, John Bull, and then there was a German one too, that are like meant to be this national synthesis of the national figure of this place. That, I mean, I don't know, it's ultimately like, I want to take a second again to assert in this show the supremacy of the unknowable. There is really something about like the world and individuals that can always surprise you and should never be underestimated or assume that like just because time's a flat circle, we know it's going to happen. We certainly do not. And that's one of the reasons why it is so hard to stop paying attention to these things. And yet we have somehow managed to at times, which is why I still think the Iran war probably going well. I don't know. I wanted to get back
it's like
to
Schrodinger's cat.
A little bit
so
too. Yeah,
it's really
like,
just whatever you think is happening.
They'll figure it out.
You'll figure out if there's oil in your tank tomorrow or not.
I mean, I hope the Iranians are having a good time and doing well. I know that they're not, but I hope that they are able to, really just everyone. I hope everyone goes home and has, a really like they feel good about, they gave it their all. They left it all on the battlefield. So that's kind of how I feel, is that, I just want everyone to do their best. So, and that's me as a liberal saying that. So anyway, I want to get back to the economic corner though, because I know you have been constantly sort of thinking about these things. Like I said, the soft, underreported, dude, let me tell you, I'll give you a story of economics in America, right? So I'm in Europe and I have a European advertising algorithm, right? And it was fascinating, honestly, because it felt like
I get that sometimes from a VPN.
It's all like dish cleaning,
travel
fluid, dish cleaning. It's all for like dish cleaning stuff and like pet food, and they're like cute, quaint, narrated ads that remind me of like early 2000s kind of.
Wow.
And there's always a sort of like time delay to a lot of the way that like trends will move through culture, emanating from the U.S. at least at this point. It's one of those soft power things, but it's charming, right? It's, the Italians, they have a knack for aesthetics, and I make my way back to the United States. And one of the first ads I get after coming back here was a man speaking looking haggard, speaking desperately into his camera and saying, "Hello, I don't know if this is real, but I got injured and I can't work anymore, and my wife got injured, and I need money to survive. We can't live."
Yeah, geez.
It is a desperate. It's like
yeah.
Saw.
American ads are just like
I'm
so
sitting there watching
stress-inducing.
This man who literally some fucking entrepreneurial whoever figured out that they can sell ad time to people who are desperate for money to plea for money, and it will bring some return from people like myself who literally were like, I do I need to click this? Like, it was really like, it was very sad. And like, the worst part is the cynicism you get of being like, you could make this with AI too, is like the horrible part. But
yeah,
seem pretty fucking real, man. I've got a pretty eye for that kind of stuff. I feel. I don't know how old I am at this point. You know, like we were just talking about how we were old men at the top of the show, but I still think I can tell an AI, fake AI voice is still pretty fucking bad. Honestly, I've been tricked by an AI image or two, but the voice is unmistakable. So it sounded like a real human with real bills that the government doesn't give a fuck about paying, and yet Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, all of them are getting fucking paid right on time. So it's it's pretty cool. It's pretty
pretty awesome.
Pretty awesome. So I mean that's just my little economic anecdote from my travels. But like, what's been on your mind economics wise? I mean, the crypto stuff, the gold stuff, the bond market. There's so much to talk about.
Yeah, there is a lot to talk about. I guess I could tie it into our discussion earlier about the notion of basically a society discovering the state or the state coming into its own, and at the same time, it's
necessary
us discovering
for fiat currency.
Yeah,
right?
It's just as we talked about with the fiat currency or the greenback, it's the discovery that in times of emergency, a state cannot afford the luxury of a hard currency, and you can't actually afford to be bound by an arbitrary restriction that is imposed by an old, antiquated way of thinking. And so that really is it's in many ways similar to thinking in an analog way versus a digital way, that there is a whole revolution of ideas that comes with that you are no longer bound to certain realities that you were in the analog world once you move into the digital world. And that's just a fact of life, and that's a fact of the state as it comes into being, as we become an empire that seems to be the empire of the world. And as we realize, this is fragmenting. Yeah. And that's a good point, that a lot of what I'm bringing up is really only as applies to the world under the U.S.'s hegemony. And I think that anybody that really says they know what's happening as this world order fragments, I think very few people really do. I think anyone who says that they do know that is probably either lying or greatly overestimating their abilities to predict the future. But ultimately, I would say that there is a pretty solid understanding at this point of how the banking system has come to work at a mechanical level, on a foundational level. And that has ultimately been in the same process of the state discovering that it can't be bounded by these old ways of thinking. And so much of our understanding of how money ought to work is really based in the gold standard. And most of that goes back at best 200 years, not even that long. And so the concept that money is gold and that the real money needs to be stored in a bank vault and it has to actually be something real, quote unquote, like gold, is still a rather new concept in the grand scheme of things. That going back to Roman times, for example, like ancient Roman times, certainly nobody would have thought that the gold was the real money and would have to be stored specially. So a lot of our concepts, such as even the concept of bank reserves, is really a really modern concept that emerged with modern banking. And credit has existed for at least as far back as ancient Sumer, so probably 5,000 years or so. And the concept that means that banking happened then, but then it had been clearly forbidden at different periods in times. So what we can say is it gets sort of rediscovered at different periods. Like in Italy, it gets rediscovered in Genoa. And a few different city-states in Italy, banking becomes a major invention. But under most of the world most of Europe during the Middle Ages, banking is forbidden, and that's imposed by the Vatican. And they're not allowing, it's considered a sin. They call it usury. And you're not allowed to charge interest. So that kind of precludes the concept of banking from even existing. But as we talked about the emergence of capitalist empires, we also talked about, or at least we sort of alluded to the part of history where Spain was the dominant empire that was under feudalism, and it ultimately crumbles and can no longer expend power and across its colonies, across the Atlantic, and so it collapses.
Domestically too.
It fails, even though it was winning the previous game where the rules to the game were have all the best land. Well, that was easy for them. They did that. They had all the best land, and so they're winning under that paradigm.
Really,
and then suddenly, over the course of only a few hundred years, island nations like Britain and Japan become the world's dominant empires because they learn how to maximize what they can out of a given unit of land, rather than just assuming I have this much land and I can always extract this much rent all the time from it, which was the feudal economy. And there was an economy under feudalism, but it was based on just this assumption of rent extraction. You inherit the land that you own, or the nation that you have is the nation you have, and it's going to have a certain amount of expected rent that it can extract. And as time went by, small islands, through the invention of banking, figured out how they could make a given unit of land, 1 square unit of land, much more efficient. And that ultimately involved the velocity of money, causing money to transact more than one time. So and this is credit. Now that you can have an institution like a bank that can lend out money, you can have it claiming to be holding money in one place, like in bank reserves. And yet it can also be lending that money multiple times at a faster velocity. And this was a major part of how capitalism emerged.
Because, and you're like, this is like, what is all that? That sounds like a bunch of hunga-junga jargon. What's that for? And it's like, it sounds like a bunch. I say this thing all the time where it's like, just because something can be understood doesn't mean it makes sense. And none of that stuff may make sense necessarily, but a lot of it is about managing risk. And that sounds very like businessy, but that's the truth of it. And what does that mean tangibly? Well, it means that instead of your guy shipping out across the ocean in a ship that he owns and his entire fucking life savings, and if and he's ruined if the ship is fucked, you now have this practice of lending and credit, wherein you can put this commodity out on the ocean where there is a tangible risk associated to it, just doing that, the thing it's supposed to do, and you're able to manage that risk differently. And better is relative, and honestly, like that's the whole like thing of it all. But it did certainly prove to be more efficient. It wasn't just that the British were, I don't know, really enjoying being on boats together. It was that they had a more agile economic system too. That was 100% part of it, and it's because they weren't hung up on all these fucking like dogmatic baggages from Catholicism. That's a part of it too. And that, the Dutch imported the technology that they had already built through the Dutch East India Company, and that ended up being a very powerful relationship for a very long time. So that's what I was getting at there. But
and so states need basically this concept of credit for the purposes of managing risk, as you said, that ultimately we even saw with ancient Sumer, that they were starting to create the concept of interest for exactly this reason, charging a little bit of surplus for built-in risk. So you can't assume 100% of your ships are going to make it across the ocean. So they started building in a small amount of interest, but then they needed to create ways to forgive those balances as the credit bubble grew. Even ancient Sumer found that they needed practices of perpetual debt forgiveness in order to regulate that credit that the state still found incredibly useful for managing risk. And so with that comes having one unit of currency being spent multiple times and being even held by multiple people, theoretically. The money that is lent to you is also being lent to multiple people. And this is agreed upon because we have a bank reserve system. And that reserve balance system, as you said, is about managing risk. That if everybody were to start to say, hey, wait a second, there's not really as much money in the supply as they say there is, and so I want to run to the bank and get my money out as soon as possible. If everybody has that thought all at once, that creates a bank run. And so there's some amount of inherent risk built into the concept of credit and banking, that if you are going to lend money at interest, even for the concept of having a small amount of surplus for risk management, that necessarily is going to create essentially fake money or credit. And that credit can essentially dry up all at once if everybody suddenly doesn't trust the concept of the economy or of society, doesn't trust really
the dollar.
That people are going to follow through with their word, ultimately, is what it comes through.
And this is what I was going to say, too, is like, this all sounds so Baroque and confusing until you understand that, like, the reason you have to kind of understand that it's like kind of grasping in the dark at the true nature of currency. And that's why this stuff works, is that, like, once you fully plug in the idea that, like, as long as people will accept money for their labor, that we could just keep printing the money, because that's really the thing that backs up the value of it, is that people will accept it for their labor. And that it's sort of like this perfect circle of logic where it's like, because people will accept the money, you can always make more money as long as there are people. And that, again, it's like it kind of, but it does, because, again, the fundamental thing that undergirds the value of money is the fact that people will exchange that money for their time and labor and the valuable things they create with that. So, or, perhaps extract in the capitalist case, right?
And ultimately, the thing driving the demand for the currency is not that the currency has inherent value to it, but that the state is going to collect it as taxes. That's what's going to create the demand. And that's it. And it's going to actually spend the money first, because that's the only possible way it could do that, is to deficit spend in that direction. It doesn't work in the other direction, because if there weren't promissory notes, there would be no dollars in circulation. You would not know what a dollar is in order to try to collect it. You would not owe anyone a dollar. And so therefore, you would have no desire to make dollars. And it really is the state's imposition of the tax on you that forces you to get dollars, not that the concept of money needs to be backed by a hard value or anything of intrinsic value, quote unquote.
Right. And it sounds so crazy, but it's something that people who really like this stuff really say, that like money really doesn't exist. It is this total abstraction, and it only exists because we all agree it works. It only works because we agree it works. It only exists because we agree to that it exists. And that is
because we allow a state to
very
exist.
Strange. Yes, and that's a very key part of that all. But I want to round the show out with something you said there that I found very timely about Italy and the whole process of rediscovering things that have been there before and are rediscovered in sort of a different context. I think, the Europeans love doing that and saying they did it for the first time. But
right, even the market.
One thing, but the state, I think there is that process that has happened before in many places, especially like places where the European states were early to be born. And this is where I want to just, close the show out on a term I have, brought up before, but I believe always roundly describes what the day and age we live in: mafia neoliberalism. And the thing about the mafia that's so interesting is that when you study its history, it's at least 2 or 3 times, at least once in Italy and then once in Florida, where there is, not in Florida, but in America specifically, where there is this process of the mafia being this sort of like rumor and this story and this thing that people talk about in hushed whispers that eventually comes out to be entirely true in like many of the most fantastical ways that you could have ever imagined.
And that it plays an integral part in the formation of the state.
Built into the state, right. It's like a key undergirding of the state. It is the dirty work that people do before they imagine they can become the actors of the state themselves.
Yeah, before they can get their son elected as a senator, like the Godfather, as I said.
And to tie that back to the Trumps, there's just one quote I wanted to close the show out by discussing, because we didn't talk about it, but there's one moment that happened, and I was literally actively traveling internationally during this, so it's like, dude, give me a break, where Trump said a civilization will be destroyed tonight thing.
Yeah.
Remember, it's like between that and the whole like tweeting about being Jesus on Easter and saying what he said, like something, he used a naughty word on Easter and then said praise Allah, which was hilarious.
Praise Allah,
I think that people have become so jaded and so tired, and ourselves included in that. But there really was a tangible sort of collective clenching that I could really feel in the air after the civilization will be destroyed comment. And I do think after that, I think that was a sort of Rubicon for a lot of people. I do think that, not to use a tired metaphor, but I do think that was a point where people really had to say, what the hell is going on here? And what are we talking about?
The dam does seem to be breaking. He's hitting actually unprecedented new lows in popularity, lower than after January 6th. Some of them are showing like 32% and even lower in the polls. Right. And I think even Fox News has him at all-time low in their polling. No one can deny that he's at his absolute lowest popularity he's ever been at.
Right. So,
and I'd say that was a significant moment to that.
Here's to more of that. End the war in Iran. Keep the strait closed. Charge major do what you got to do, fellas over at the RGC. Do what you got to do.
That charging of fees, we are learning too, just to close this one out. It is showing, people are saying that Iran now is a 4th superpower of the world. And it goes to show that the process of charging fees, that idea of mafia neoliberalism, if you can extract the fee and gain monopoly control over a territory, you do it.
Flow, and like that, a trade path.
Yeah, they were not doing that even though they had the ability, because it was against the law and it was international waters. But after Trump broke the law, it became tit for tat. And so now they're leveraging the power that they had regionally and could have used, but were not actually using to control that trade route. And now it's much like the richest man ever in history, Jacob Fugger.
Yeah.
He figured that out too by charging toll routes.
Well, that's how the Habsburgs got started too.
Yeah,
they say they had royal blood, but they had a little fucking toll road in the
birth
Alps
of a
or
state.
Something. Yeah, exactly. So, look out for the next Florida episodes coming soon. We really are excited to keep plugging through that. I've discovered some fantastic, not discovered, but I've found some good stuff in my travels that I plan to bring into that show. So look out for that. You got anything you wanna drop for before we sign off here?
Yeah, one more relevant thought is that the term feudalism actually derives from fee, to charge a fee. And so that ties in right there with state gaining power ultimately is just that they gained monopoly power of force over a territory and they charged a fee over that territory. Right. And nothing has really ever changed since feudalism.
And we understand that taxation is a continued extension of this. We know that this is the same historical drive changing its justification over time. And yet, we still believe, and some would say naively, and I would say, grow up, that better things are possible, and having an organized state that is rational and able to manage a financial system that helps, manage and collectivize risk, there are tangible benefits to that can, change people's lives and benefit the majority of people. This is, call us crazy, but I'd say that's. Would you concur, Doctor? I
would concur.
Awesome. Well, I'm gonna sign off here because I gotta run. It's late over here, but thank you I missed you, buddy. It's good to chat again.
You too.
Well, thanks for listening. If you've listened this far,
one soon.
We'll be recording again soon. We're back in the swing of things, and if you've been listening, thank you so much. If you're subscribed to the Patreon, thank you even more. And please consider subscribing if you're listening and not, because as I mentioned on our last episode, we did recently lose the patronage of the Ayatollah of Iran. And so that's been tough.
As you mentioned on the last episode too, this could be the last episode.
This could That's true. That's always true. He literally said a civilization. What a fucking freak. Dude, get these fucking monsters out of there. But yeah, this could be the last episode. So could the last one. Hope not, but no one knows what the future holds. So until next time, dear listener, we'll be back soon. Bye-bye. We don't highlight the means, so we settle for them greens. Yeah, I'm highlight the trees when I send it to my knees. I don't sway with the breeze. They can send me to my knees, yeah.